Hey everyone, welcome back to another deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you back on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
Now we're going to be talking about something today that I think is super fascinating. A lot of our listeners actually requested this one.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is a big one. We're going to be talking about the insurgency in Northeast India.
A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, and we really want to go beyond just like the surface level stuff, right? We want to really understand like what's going on there. For those of you who are maybe new to the show or new to this topic.
Right, for those who are just starting to learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We want to kind of give a bit of an overview first, right? So Northeast India, for those who aren't familiar, is made up of 8 states.
8 beautiful states.
8 beautiful states, that's right.
Really unique part of the country.
It really is.
Yeah.
Often called the Seven Sisters.
The Seven Sisters plus Sikkim.
Plus Sikkim.
Right.
And it's an incredibly diverse region, both geographically and culturally.
Yeah. That's right. Geographically, it's tucked away. It's almost like it's nestled between these giants, right? You've got China, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Bangladesh.
And it's connected to the rest of India by this very narrow corridor.
That's right, the Siliguri corridor.
Sometimes called the chicken neck.
You hear that a lot, the chicken neck.
The chicken neck, which is kind of an ominous name when you think about it.
Yeah, it's a little bit, yeah.
But it highlights its strategic importance.
Absolutely.
Because if something were to happen to that corridor, it would essentially cut off the entire Northeast from the rest of India.
It's a vulnerability, that's for sure.
So before we get into the specifics of the insurgency itself, it's important to understand, I think, just geographically, how strategically vital this region is to India.
Right, it's like a gateway to Southeast Asia and beyond.
Exactly.
It plays a huge role in India's Act East policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's a really important point to make because it's not just about like what's happening internally within the region.
Right, it's a much bigger picture.
It's the geopolitical implications as well.
Exactly. And historically, it's been a bit isolated from mainland India.
And that isolation has actually played a role in shaping the dynamics of the insurgency.
Absolutely. The British, during their colonial rule, they had this policy, right? They called it the Inner Line Permit System.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. That's still in effect in some areas today, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I think a lot of people, even within India, don't really understand what that is. So maybe you could give us a quick explanation.
Sure. So basically, it's like a travel document.
Yeah.
Right? You need it if you're an Indian citizen and you want to enter certain protected areas within the Northeast.
Okay.
And the British introduced this system to kind of control trade and movement.
Right, to kind of protect the indigenous populations.
Exactly. But you can see how even with good intentions, it creates this sense of separation.
Yeah, like a barrier.
Yeah, like us and them.
And I imagine that feeling of separation didn't just vanish after India gained independence.
No, not at all. In fact, it intensified in some ways because now you have these newly independent states and they're trying to forge their own identity.
And within those states, you have all these different tribal groups with their own distinct cultures and languages and histories.
Exactly. It's incredibly diverse.
Yeah, I think over 200 different tribal groups in the region.
Something like that, yeah.
Which is just mind-boggling.
It's a really unique part of the world.
It is.
Yeah.
And so when India gained independence, there were a lot of anxieties among these tribal groups about losing their identity, their culture, their autonomy.
They felt like they were being marginalized.
Yeah. And this is where we start to see the seeds of the insurgency being sown.
You see groups like the All-Party Hill Leaders Conference, the APHLC. They emerged in the 60s, and they were really vocal about demanding greater autonomy for these hill communities.
And their efforts actually led to the creation of new states, right?
That's right.
Like Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura.
Carved out of Assam.
Carved out of Assam. So it was a recognition of their unique identities.
Yeah.
And an attempt to address some of these concerns. But the insurgency didn't just disappear.
No.
Did it?
It's complex.
It's complex.
Right.
And I think part of the reason why it's so complex is that it's not monolithic.
Right. It's not just one group, one cause.
It's not like one group with one goal.
It varies from state to state.
Exactly. There are different drivers in different states, and we're going to get into those specifics a little bit later.
Yeah, we'll break it down.
But first, I think it's important to kind of lay out some of the broader factors that are fueling these movements.
The common threads.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of those key factors. What are some of the things that are really driving this insurgency?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to look at the issue of funding. These insurgent groups, they need money to operate,
They
right?
need weapons, they need to train recruits, they need to
Ugh.
sustain their operations.
Right, so where does that money come from? Well, unfortunately, a lot of it comes from illicit activities. Things like extortion,
Oh, okay.
arms smuggling, and even the drug trade.
The drug trade. So we're talking about like a pretty significant criminal element here.
Yeah, it's a shadowy world. And
Right.
the Northeast's proximity to the Golden Triangle.
Right. That's a major drug producing region.
It is. It makes it very easy for these groups to kind of tap into that illicit network.
So it's almost like the lack of economic opportunities in some areas is actually making the region more vulnerable to this kind of activity,
Absolutely.
which then feeds back into the insurgency. It's like a vicious cycle.
It's a cycle of violence and poverty.
And then on top of that, you have this incredible ethnic diversity that we talked about earlier.
Right. Over 200 tribal groups, each with their own unique culture, language, history, and sometimes tensions with each other.
Yeah. So it's not just about fighting for independence from India.
Yeah.
It's also about navigating this incredibly complex web of internal conflicts and competing interests.
Absolutely. It's about identity. It's about land.
Yeah.
It's about resources.
And that adds, I think, a whole other layer to the challenge of finding peace in the region.
It does. And then you can't forget about the issue of economic disparity, right? You have areas that are very underdeveloped,
Lack of job.
lack of opportunities, and when people feel marginalized, when they feel like they have no future,
Especially young people.
especially young people, they become very susceptible to recruitment by these insurgent groups.
Because they're offering them something.
They offer a sense of purpose,
A sense of belonging.
a sense of belonging, a way to make a living, a way to fight back against the system that they feel has failed them.
Yeah. So it's not just about like wanting to topple the government or secede from India.
Right.
It's often about much deeper, more complex issues.
It's about survival sometimes.
Yeah. And then, of course, we can't ignore the role of external influences.
Yeah, this is where it gets a little sensitive.
It does. But it's important to talk about it. I mean, it's no secret that some of these insurgent groups have received support from neighboring countries.
It's a reality, and it makes the situation much more difficult to address.
Yeah, because you're trying to essentially solve an internal problem
Mm.
while there are these external forces that are kind of fueling the fire.
It's like trying to put out a fire while someone's pouring gasoline on it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good analogy. And
Mhm.
and this external support can take many forms, right?
It can. Sometimes it's providing safe havens
Right.
for these groups, training camps.
Or even supplying them with weapons and funding.
Exactly. So it's a real challenge for India to try to address this internally when you have these external factors at play.
And then on top of all of this, you have the issue of internal displacement.
Right, the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah. So people are forced to flee their homes.
Because of violence, because of fear.
Right. And this creates a whole other set of problems, doesn't it?
It does. You have humanitarian crises. You have communities that are uprooted, traumatized, and that trauma can then be exploited by insurgent groups.
To recruit more members. It's like a cycle of suffering.
It's a cycle of violence and displacement.
And I think that's something that's really important for our listeners to understand.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the politics, it's about the people.
The human dimension.
Yeah. We're talking about real lives, real communities that have been torn apart by this conflict.
And it's important to remember that. It's a lot to take in, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface here, and it's already so clear how complex and multifaceted this issue is.
Yeah, and we haven't even gotten into the specifics of each state yet.
Right. Because, we keep saying this, but it's so important to remember that the insurgency in Northeast India isn't monolithic.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation at all.
Each state has its own unique story, its own dynamics, its own challenges.
And its own potential paths to peace.
Exactly. So before we dive into those specifics, I think it's important to kind of step back and talk about, what can be done about this.
Yeah, what are the solutions?
What are the solutions? What are the strategic imperatives for actually addressing this issue and achieving lasting peace in the region?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that there's no magic bullet.
Yeah, no easy answers here.
It's not as simple as just sending in the troops and hoping for the best.
Right. That's never really worked anywhere, has it?
No, especially not with insurgencies. You need a multifaceted approach.
Okay. So what does that look like? What are some of the key elements of a successful strategy?
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to understand the root causes that we've been talking about.
Right? We can't just treat the symptoms,
Exactly. We need to address the underlying issues that are driving this conflict.
whether it's poverty or inequality or lack of development or historical grievances.
All of those things. We need to understand what's fueling this fire before we can hope to put it out.
And it's not just about economic development, right?
No, it's about social justice.
It's about political empowerment.
It's about giving people a sense of belonging, a stake in the system.
Right. So that they don't feel like they need to resort to violence to be heard.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another crucial element, which is winning the trust of the people.
Yeah, because ultimately they're the ones who are caught in the middle of this conflict.
Exactly. And it's a tug of war in many ways, right? The insurgent groups are trying to win the support of the people.
While the government's trying to do the same.
Exactly. So the government needs to demonstrate that it's the more reliable, more trustworthy partner.
Right. If people feel safe and secure,
Mhm.
and they believe that the government is working in their best interests.
They're less likely to be swayed by these insurgent groups.
It's about building relationships.
It's
It's about addressing grievances.
providing essential services, showing people that the government is there for them.
Okay, so we've got addressing the root causes.
Right.
We've got winning the trust of the people. What else?
Well, I think security is obviously a big part of it as well.
Of course. I mean,
Right.
you can't have peace without security.
Exactly. But it's not just about having a large military presence.
Right. We've seen that often backfires.
It can. It can alienate the population. It can create more resentment.
So what's the right approach then?
It's about having the right kind of forces trained and equipped for the specific challenges of operating in the Northeast.
So quality over quantity.
Exactly. They need to understand the terrain, the culture, the languages.
They need to be sensitive to the local context.
Absolutely. They need to be able to operate effectively in a complex and often hostile environment.
And they need to do it while respecting human rights.
Absolutely. That's crucial. Any violation, any misstep can set back peace efforts by years.
Right. And this reminds me of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, this
Yeah.
AFSPA.
Yeah, that's a controversial one.
It is. Because on the one hand, it gives the security forces these special powers to operate in these areas that are designated as disturbed areas.
But on the other hand, it's been criticized for giving them too much power without enough accountability.
So there's this constant tension, isn't there,
There is.
between the need for security and the need to protect human rights.
Striking that balance is one of the biggest challenges.
And I imagine it's not easy, especially in a situation like this where the lines are often blurred.
It's not. But it's essential. We need to ensure that security measures are implemented in a way that respects the rule of law and the dignity of individuals.
Okay. So we've talked about security, but we also need intelligence, right?
Absolutely. Intelligence is crucial.
Because you need to understand who you're dealing with.
Right. You need to know their motivations, their strategies, their networks.
You need to be able to anticipate their moves.
Exactly. So intelligence gathering is a really important part of this whole equation.
And it's not just about knowing where the enemy is, right?
No, it's about understanding why they're fighting,
What their goals are, what their grievances are.
what their strengths and weaknesses are, how they operate within the community.
Right. And that information can then inform the government's strategy.
Absolutely. It can help them to counter propaganda, disrupt recruitment efforts, and address grievances more effectively.
So it's about being smart, not just strong.
Exactly. It's about using a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer.
I like that. Okay. So we've got the root causes, we've got security, we've got intelligence.
We've got winning the trust of the people.
Right. That's a lot of moving parts.
It is, and that's why unity of effort is so important.
There's that phrase again. Unity of effort. What does that mean in this context?
It means that all government agencies, security forces, and even civil society organizations need to be working together seamlessly.
Sharing information, coordinating their actions.
Having a common goal, a shared understanding of what they're trying to achieve.
It's like a well-oiled machine.
Exactly, where all the parts are working together smoothly and efficiently.
But that requires strong leadership, doesn't it?
It does. You need leaders who understand the complexities of the situation, who can build consensus, and who can inspire those on the ground.
Leaders who can see the big picture but also pay attention to the details.
And who are willing to listen to the people.
Right, because ultimately this is about the people, isn't it?
It is.
It's about their lives, their livelihoods, their futures. So how do we translate all of this into action? I mean, we've talked about a lot of abstract concepts here. What are some concrete steps that can be taken to actually move towards that vision of peace and development?
Well, I think, we keep coming back to this, but addressing those root causes is essential.
Right. We can't just ignore the underlying issues.
We can't. We need to tackle poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment head on.
Create economic opportunity.
Improve access to education and healthcare.
Make sure that the benefits of development reach all segments of society.
And that those development efforts are sustainable and inclusive.
Right. It's not just about building roads and bridges.
It's about empowering communities.
Giving them a voice in the decision-making process.
Respecting their cultures and tradition.
Protecting the environment.
Building a future where everyone feels like they belong and have a chance to thrive.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect, which is reconciliation.
Right. Healing the wounds of the past.
Because you can't just build a peaceful future on top of unresolved grievances and historical trauma.
You need to address those issues head on.
You need to create spaces for dialogue.
For truth-telling.
For forgiveness.
For healing.
And that's a long and difficult process.
It is, but it's essential.
And it requires the participation of everyone.
The government, the insurgent groups, civil society, the people themselves.
It's a collective effort.
It is, and it's not just about ending the violence.
It's about building a more just and equitable society.
Where everyone has a chance to live a life of dignity and peace.
And that's a vision worth fighting for.
It is.
It's a pretty daunting task, though, isn't it?
Oh,
We've been talking about all these challenges and these deep-rooted issues.
It is a daunting task, but it's not impossible.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that there have been successes.
Absolutely. There have been some really inspiring examples of peace building in the Northeast.
Okay, so let's talk about those. Give us some hope here.
All right. Well, one example that we've already touched upon is the Tripura model.
Right. Tripura has really turned things around.
They have. They went from having this really intense insurgency to a period of relative peace and stability.
So how did they do it?
Well, I think a key factor was their focus on addressing those root causes that we keep talking about.
Right, so not just focusing on the military side of things.
Exactly. They invested heavily in education, healthcare, economic opportunities.
And they really made an effort to empower local communities.
Give them a voice in the process.
So it was a holistic approach.
It was. And it's paid off. They've seen a significant decline in violence.
And I think they've also made some progress in reintegrating former insurgents into mainstream society.
They have. It's a really good example of how a multi-pronged approach can work.
So it's not just about defeating the insurgents militarily.
No. It's about creating a more just and equitable society.
Where people feel like they have a stake in the peace process.
Exactly.
Okay. Any other examples?
Yeah, I think the resolution of the Mizo insurgency back in 1986 is another great example.
Oh yeah, Mizoram. They got a pretty remarkable journey.
They have. From conflict to statehood to peace.
So what were the key ingredients there?
Well, it was a combination of things. Strong leadership on both sides.
So people who were willing to actually sit down and talk to each other.
Exactly. And a recognition of the Mizo people's aspirations for autonomy.
So the government was willing to compromise.
They were. And the Mizo National Front, the MNF, they agreed to lay down their arms in exchange for statehood.
So it was a win-win situation.
It was. And it paved the way for peace and development in Mizoram.
These are really inspiring examples.
They are.
I mean, they show that even in the face of such complex challenges, peace is possible.
It is. But it takes work. It takes commitment. It takes a willingness to understand the other side.
So what are some of the key takeaways here? What can we learn from these success stories that can be applied elsewhere in the region?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. Each state is unique.
Exactly. What works in Tripura might not work in Manipur or Nagaland.
So you need a tailored approach.
You do. You need to understand the specific context of each situation.
And I think the second takeaway is that peace building is a long-term process.
It is. There are no quick fixes.
It's about addressing those root causes.
Building trust. Creating sustainable solutions.
And the third takeaway?
Dialogue is crucial.
Absolutely. You can't achieve peace without talking to each other.
Right. You need to create spaces where people can come together, air their grievances, and work towards a shared future.
And that includes talking to the insurgent groups.
It does. You can't just ignore them or try to crush them militarily.
You need to find a way to bring them into the fold.
And that requires a willingness to listen, to understand their perspectives, and to find common ground.
And the fourth takeaway?
Development. We've said it before, but it's so important.
Right. Investing in education, healthcare, infrastructure,
Creating economic opportunity.
Giving people a reason to believe in a better future.
Exactly. And I think the final takeaway is that we need to involve everyone in the peace process.
Especially women and young people.
Absolutely. They're often the most affected by conflict.
And their voices and perspectives are essential for building a lasting peace.
They are. So those are some of the key takeaways, I think, from these success stories.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion.
It has.
I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from the history of the insurgency to the challenges to the potential solutions.
And it's clear that this is a really complex issue.
It is, but it's also an issue that's incredibly important.
Because it's about the lives of real people.
Absolutely.
It's about the future of a region that's incredibly vital to India.
And it's a region that's worth fighting for.
Not with guns and bombs.
But with dialogue, development, and a commitment to justice and equality.
Well said. Well, that's all the time we have for today, but I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the insurgency in Northeast India.
It's been a pleasure.
And we hope that you've learned something new and that you'll continue to explore this topic.
Keep diving deep.
Absolutely. Until next time, take care.